Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the Washington Outsider Report on the Coalition Radio. With you is Irina Zuckerman. I'm the editor in chief of the Washington Outsider, and today we have a special. Uh, and today we have a special guest, Asaad Hanna, who is an international relations fellow with Columbia University. He's a international security analyst, a former White Helmet, and a published author. He will discuss with us the expected normalization and rehabilitation of Bashar Assad in Syria. Is this a bold new vision, or is this a tired old strategy that is bound to backfire? Before we delve into that topic, Asad will tell us a little bit more about himself, his background, and from there we'll take it into the heart of the issue.
Thank you, Rena. Hello everybody. I'm Asad Hanna, and as Irena said, I'm now fellow with Columbia University in New York, and I do international affairs, international relation. I'm a specialist in the international security policies and conflict resolutions, and I did work with many organizations before following the Syrian situation and starting from the beginning of the Syrian revolution in March 2011. And I was following the situation on the ground and worked with many research institutes and media outlets on the field of covering the situation and also writing policy papers and researches. I was also involved with some of the so-called by that time the Friends of the Syrian People, which was a coalition of countries, mainly from Europe, the US, UK, and other countries who were supporting what the Syrian people were asking for: democracy, changing the regime, elections, and finally we stuck with at least justice and accountability for more than 500,000 people we lost in Syria. Irena?
And, and are you still continuing with those efforts, or are you just now fully with Columbia University?
Yeah, I'm still working on in those fields, especially on advocating for the Syrian case and justice and accountability, as I mentioned. I don't do that as work. I do it more as
Mhm.
burden in our shoulders, that, as we call it, that we have to carry it wherever we go. So I'm still involved with that. I'm still involved with some projects inside Syria and with Syrian refugees also, and doing media stuff time to time. I don't do that like every day, but we have to talk about it. We have to nail it when we have time to do that and when we can do that. So it's our duty.
So, from what I've seen, before we get into the most, political issue, I just wanted to get your opinion on kind of the media coverage of the events in Syria. Because from what I've seen, the media tends to conflict jump, as I call it. They cover a new conflict intensely for a period of time. Then, when it appears that it it's not going anywhere, or that the issue has either semi resolved itself, or is has gotten bad enough that there's really no resolution possible in the near future, they tend to jump to the next new breakout conflict, and so on, without really paying attention to the long term implications of the events. And this is what I kind of saw what happened with Syria after the heat of the civil war died down, and everyone was sort of stuck with the policy. The media coverage of the events in Syria itself sort of ceased. For a while, the media covered refugee crisis in Europe, but then it even that sort of kind of died away, and they stopped following what happened to all these people completely. And I'm, what's your take on it? Do you notice? Is there any media interest in what's going on in Syria today? Because outside our monitor and a couple of other publications, I don't really see all that much except to cover what US is doing on that front.
Yeah, you are totally right on that, and I'm so happy that you brought up the refugees in Europe because I want to answer on your question by by one example. If you remember when Germany was following the open borders policy of welcoming all the refugees, and they hosted a lot of refugees, and that was a good thing that they gave them safe place to stay. But by that time, the media in Germany was all focusing on positive refugees, on positive stories, telling how people who are coming to Germany, they are educated, how people are integrating in the community, how people are working, how Germany will benefit of those hundred of thousands of Syrian refugees, and like just spreading every day like dozens of positive stories about the Syrian refugees who are coming to Germany. That's how all the German media was working, most of the German media. And then when there was changing in the government and Germany closed the borders and they don't want, there was problems between the parties and they don't want to welcome refugees anymore and they want to stop refugees from coming. So they started to, like you realized on the media, it was like more like those refugees are criminals, those refugees are rapists, those refugees are not going to work, they are putting like they are the German government is spending a lot of money on them, all that taxes are going there, and like that speech increased, and we started to don't witness any positive story. So what I'm saying that just to say media takes what serve their policies. Media takes and cover what they want. So if the US want tomorrow to withdraw from Syria, the media who wants to support that decision will start saying, "Oh, that's right. That's the right decision to do," and they will start making interviews with people who just want the American army to go out of Syria. And if the media doesn't like if the media is not like the policy they are following is to oppose the American government, whatever they want to do, whatever they are doing, so they would start covering Syria every day, saying how miserable the situation there and how wrong the decision of withdrawing from Syria, and like so, it's just like the media is tool for either governments or money or funders to so it's not about that they care about what's happening there. And after 10 years of Syrian evolution and conflict and covering, they don't see any interest for them in that area. So that's why we don't see any covering for the situation. Just maybe some few shows like your program and very few other people who still covering the situation in Syria.
The other day, I saw information about the Russian bombardment uh, in Syria, which unfortunately killed a young child and injured civilians. What exactly were they bombarding? Because none of that has really made it into the press. What Russia continues to play a significant role in Syria and is expected to continue to do so. But who exactly are they claiming to fight now?
I don't know. They are just bombing civilians. They are just as they used to do. Like starting from when Russia intervened in Syria, there was never almost never attack on ISIS. ISIS was defeated by the
Mhm.
international coalition, not by the Russians, not by the Syrian army. It was by the international coalition and support of other groups on the ground. And Russia now is just making like enjoying making the life of the people who are living out of the government controlled area, they are just enjoying making their life miserable. So they are attacking, like as you mentioned, that child, he was killed along with other members from his family, and like there's still some of his family members, they still in the hospitals in the IR. So like, who are you killing? Who are you targeting? And like, if it's not randomly attacked, it's like they know what they are attacking, and they know that they are attacking civilians. They know that they are attacking camps. They are attacking school. They just want to send a message to the people who are living out of the Assad regime controlled areas to say, you are not safe wherever you go. You are not safe in Idlib. You are not safe in Aleppo. You are not safe, because if there is no bombardment in these areas, those areas would thrive. Those areas would be stable. People would start rebuilding their homes. People would maybe start building some kind of life or business or something in those areas. Russia doesn't want that. Russia wants them to suffer, wants civilians to suffer, wants civilians to feel unstable. Literally, there are some families, or many families in those areas, they are displaced and moved between more than 20 houses in the last few years. They just moved town to town, and like after, like, because the Russian and the Syrian regime will attack this town, so they moved to another area, and then that area got attacked, so they moved to another area, and like that's how they lost their children. That's how they lost their family members. That's how like many half million people died in Syria. They were not army fighters. Some of them were, but most of them, they are civilians who died when they were eating, who died when they were at the school, when the school was bombed by the airstrikes. So it's just attacks to make the life of the people miserable because they don't agree with this government.
And who exactly are the targets? Are these populations that are largely under kind of SDF control, kind of sort of the coalition, international coalition controlled areas, or are they just
No,
randomly
the
attacking
attack wasn't.
anyone?
No, the attack that attack, the one you mentioned when that
Hmm.
child was killed. I think you were talking about the photo I published a few days ago. So
Yes.
that was in Idlib countryside, in a
Hmm.
town near Idlib city. So it's not SDF controlled area. SDF controlled area is not being attacked at all from the Syrian regime. Like there is no bombardment in this area. It's thriving. They are extracting the oil. They are making money out of it. They are spending it they're spending a lot of it on the militarization of this area. The attacks, the bombardment, the shelling, the shooting, snipers, it's all on northwest of Syria, where it's Idlib and Idlib countryside and Aleppo countryside, and a small portion of Latakia countryside.
So the Idlib area has become somewhat infamous for being under Turkish control, but Turkey and Russia seem to have come to a sort of agreement, and rather than going at each other as they were at one point in time, uh,
Mm-hmm.
there seems to be no consequence to these bombardments. What exactly is Turkey's interest in Idlib now, and why is Russia kind of allowed to bombard those areas with no repercussions from anyone?
Yeah, so Turkey would not ruin their relation with Russia to talk about a bombardment where, I'm sorry to say that, but that's how they think about it, that few people were killed. Turkey has interests in Syria, first to secure their borders, second to don't allow Kurdish canton on their borders
Mhm.
from the Syrian side. And that's what they were being like, that's how they are using the Syrian groups, the Syrian military groups, what they call it, the national army, not to fight the Syrian regime. Like they are arming that army and training them and supporting them and funding them just to use them in some useless wars where they want them to fight for the Turkish interest, like fighting against SDF. Every now and then there's rumors that another battle is looping in the area where Turkey would ask the Syrian National Army to go and fight in northeast of Syria to fight against the SDF. So that's not the point. That's the point of the Turkish interest. But what's happening in Idlib, if like when there is escalation, I'm talking about constant attacks for several days and hundreds of casualties and attacks on hospitals and schools. So Turkey maybe would say to the Russians, would you stop that, please? Can you stop that, please? But they never, after when the Turkish army shut down the Russian military jet, and the relation between the Turks and the Russians got so bad, almost like they boycott each other, no flights, no trading, no diplomatic relation. So after that, they agreed that whatever happens in Syria, we're not going to fight over it. Let's agree on keeping our relation ahead of everything. So that's why I'm saying Turkey would not ruin their relation with Russia because Russia is killing 10 civilians every day. So they are fine with that, obviously, and I'm sorry for that.
And just to understand the situation a little better, a portion of these Turkish-backed militias ended up being sent to Libya for other operations there. What happened to the jihadist groups on the ground and Al Qaeda and some of these other various factions that ended up being such a focal point of this activity? And at one point, they seem to be almost kind of, some of them were clashing with the government forces, some of them were clashing with each other, some of them were sort of coalescing with the Turkish militias. What happened to all these various non-state actors? Where did they all go, or are they still there?
So those groups are the lefted groups from the former program of training the Syrian opposition. There was that program when they were training and supporting the Syrian opposition by multiple countries who they were supporting the Syrian people, as I mentioned at the beginning. And then that program stopped. So Turkey picked up those people who were engaged in that program. And then they started also drafting, or it's not forcibly drafting, it's like whoever want to join, they can sign up and join. So they created also new divisions. So they took former divisions, which was trained and armed by the Western countries, and then they also created new divisions. So it's massive number. It's almost like a lot. It's I don't have certain number for how many people were there, but it's a lot of people. So it's not that. And also when they sent people to Libya or to other countries, they didn't send all the fighters. They asked every division to send, let's say, 10% or 15% or 25% of their men, of their fighters. So they didn't take everyone there, let's go to fight in Libya. It was like groups, also groups to go, groups to come back. And the areas which is under the Turkish control, there's no threat from the Assad regime on this area. So even if there is no Syrian fighters on the border, the Syrian regime would not crush on this area. And obviously that's the understanding between the Turks and the Russians, that those areas are considered under the Turkish control. So the Syrian regime would not be allowed, like the Russian would not allow the Syrian regime to retake those areas, at least for now. We don't know for the future. And then that's mostly Aleppo countryside. If we go to Idlib countryside, it's not all under Al-Qaeda influence. There's parts under the Qaeda or HTS or whatever we call it. They changed many names. And then another part is under the Turkish influenced groups or the National Army. So this area is being bombed, not the one in Aleppo countryside. Sometimes there are attacks on Aleppo countryside, but not as much as Idlib.
Meanwhile, the last that has been for a while, Assad was seen as trying to reconsolidate his control over the territory, and he seemed to have kind of cracked down on a lot of his own people internally. He had shifted away of some of his financial supporters and backers in favor of a closer internal control. There was a concern about the crackdowns within the intelligence apparatus. All of this discussion seems to have simmered away, and some of his supporters who had fallen out of influence for a while seem to be kind of back in the game. They've been seen in Western countries playing around. What exactly is going on that front? What is the state of Assad's um, current role? Is, all I've been hearing, well, the government is getting more and more corrupt. People are all these projects are just benefiting smaller numbers of close government officials. But what's the actual situation? What's happening on that front? What's his position currently?
So everything is happening in Syria now. Everything you said and even more. So in Syria, it used to be 20 million people, and now under the regime control, there is less than 10 million people. So more than half they left Syria, and that's first point. Second point is there's no economy. There's the sanction. They are not allowing the companies to go there, even if there are no sanctions. Companies doesn't want to go to do work there. Some companies does, but the international good reputation, especially now with the ESG policies and respecting the human values and all of that, they don't want to go. Some businessmen would love to make some money out of the war there and removing the destroyed rubbles and all of that. So yeah, some businessmen, some companies would love to go there, but not on a big scale. And we are talking on country where they need everything. You need like the Syrian budget, the Syrian annual budget, the whole government budget, I think, for 2021 was $200 million. Like $200 million, like it's nothing for a whole government. And the currency value was, let's say, before 2011, it was $1.50 Syrian pound. Now $1 is above 3,000. I think it's like 3,500 Syrian pound. So it's like there's almost no Syrian pound. So there is no economy. The family needs is, let's say, $200 a month, $300 a month for like small family. That's about a million Syrian pound. Meanwhile, the salary of a teacher or like medium job or something, it's under 100,000. It's like 75,000 Syrian pound. So I'm saying economically, the country is collapsed. There is no economy. There is no support for the families, and that's why people are more fleeing out of Syria. Meanwhile, the world is talking about let's send the refugees back to Syria. It's not about just there is no airstrikes in Damascus or in Homs or in Hama. It's not about only the airstrikes. If you want to send them there, even if it's safe, even if the regime would not arrest them, which he would, but even though there's nothing to live off there, there is no jobs, there is no financial support, and if you give the money to the government would not give it to the people because the government need the money to fund the army who's still spread all around the country because they know if they take back the army, the opposition would take those areas. So there's big scale of corruption because the families need money to live. In addition to the known corruption in Syria since 1960, 1970, where that's what the Ba'ath Party raised the people on to be corrupted, to take bribes, and that's how it's going now. So yeah, there's no economy, there's no respectful for the human values. 200,000 people still in prisons in Syria or disappeared, uh, and people. I literally hear every day few people from who I know there. They are just leaving the country for good. Same what's happening in Lebanon also. At least in Lebanon, there is no arresting. There is no putting like disappearing for people. So yeah.
So we are seeing a few different developments, and I'll try to kind of take one issue at a time because otherwise it's going to be a little too complicated. So I'll
Yeah.
start with the US, trying to understand the US position. US renewed its support to SDF as a matter of policy, but at the same time has tried to be accommodating to Turkey on, or at least not be seen as overly aggressive with Turkey. With respect to Syria, we've seen two contradictory political statements. On the one hand, we've heard discussions about lifting sanctions related to the Assad regime. On the other hand, we
Hmm.
have seen the State Department issue a statement that US has no intention of normalizing and rehabilitating Assad. How do you read this seemingly polar opposite statements? How is lifting major sanctions not normalizing and rehabilitating Assad? I mean, he has not been held accountable, he hasn't recanted, he has not stopped whatever he was doing. What, and at the same time, I guess non-normalization means no diplomatic rapprochement. What exactly is the goal of Washington in this, and how do you explain this strange conundrum?
So you're asking what is the policy of the American government, and I would say their policy is they have no policy on Syria. And I'm not joking. I'm seriously talking. The U.S. government has army in Syria, but they don't have policy. In the previous government, they used to have policy. We liked it, we didn't, but every question we asked, they had answers for it. Like, we have policy. Those 5 points. They had Joe Rabin, Jim Jeffrey, doing almost monthly meetings with the Syrian people, NGOs, like key factors in the Syrian communities, and like talking to them. Sometimes they changed their policy because the Syrian people convinced them at some point. Sometimes they convinced other people. Sometimes like we didn't agree with them, but that was a policy the U.S. government had for what they are doing in Syria. Like no withdrawing for the troops until the Iranian go out of Syria. We are securing the oil to don't fall in the hands of the Syrian regime. Caesar sanctions are staying in place until the Syrian regime implement specific conditions, which is releasing the detainees and like political transition, 2254, and all of that. So they had answers, they had policy to discuss, but now they don't. As you say, they are revoking sanctions from war criminals who killed hundreds of thousands of people. They are revoking the sanctions on them. It's like telling them, you are fine. You got ticket, we remove the ticket. You are fine to drive. And when we ask them about like why you are doing that, they say, no, 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 we are not doing that. We are not normalizing with the Syrian regime. Don't worry, everything in place. They want us to reach to a point where they would say, well, this is the situation. We cannot do anything with it. I remember once when, and I think you do remember that with me, when United Arab Emirates in 2019, I think, yeah, 19 or beginning of 20, they wanted to reopen the embassy in Damascus. They wanted to normalize with the Syrian regime. The next day, Jim Jeffrey and Joel
Mhm.
Rabin flew to Dubai and met with them, and they said that's not acceptable. You cannot do that, and we, as the United States, don't accept that, and we don't encourage you to do that. And if you will do that, you would be under the same sanction of the Syrian regime. And then Dubai or like UAE, they stopped all the talks about normalization with the Syrian regime, and that exactly was at the beginning of Corona. They said, okay, let us just send some health support. They sent about $200 million of medical aid. I remember to say, I don't know how the Syrian government used it, but that was the deal. And yeah, but now what we see is Jordan is calling with the Syrian regime, uh, initiating the re-establishing the relation with the Syrian regime, opening the borders for doing the trade. This trade would benefit the Syrian regime of giving him fresh dollars that would give the regime more money to fund the military and to fund the military operations and the Syrian army, to build more presence, because we know he would not build schools with this money. The regime never built schools. He built like 17 military branch in Syria. Meanwhile, we still have the same number of universities since 1923. So yeah, and now we see United Arab Emirates. People are talking about coming trip for Bashar al-Assad to go to visit Dubai, and that would be his first trip out. People are talking about also rejoining the Arab League, and
Hmm.
so, and
That's
whenever
by
we
the way not.
call on,
Hmm.
hmm? Go
That's
ahead.
by the way, the Arab League is not a new development. That's been going back a couple of years now, but hasn't fully materialized because a couple of years ago it didn't really have as much support. Now it's the momentum seems to be shifting.
Yeah, because the countries who they were supporting that, they were seeing opposing from the American side, so they were not supporting that
Hmm.
decision because they didn't want to get trouble with the U.S. But now, when
Hmm.
those countries, they are saying, like, let's say Iraq would, like, they know now the U.S. would not tell them to don't support that, so they would call for it. Jordan, same. Egypt, maybe the same. So I know just like maybe 2 or 3 countries, they still bold about like, no, we would not accept the Syrian regime to join the Arab League. But how long, for how long they can maintain that pressure? Meanwhile, most of the countries, they are now leaning toward, okay, let's go back to before 2011. Everything is going back in place. We need to support that guy who he was in our group before. And as the U.S., so when the U.S. doesn't oppose it, that means the U.S. support it. That's how those countries understand. And now, whenever we are calling, like I had some calls unofficial with the people in the State Department, they were saying, no, there is nothing like normalization. We still bold on, we are like stricted about that. And that's when the State Department, when the Secretary of State, Tony Blinken, 2 weeks ago, he issued that statement of, well, we don't agree on that and we're still against it. But what they are doing to stop it, nothing. I believe if the US would call the UAE and ask them to stop the normalization and do the same with Jordan of don't open the borders, those countries would stop. It's like it's a grip of power to in the Middle East used to be like that. And now we are not seeing that. So, and those countries understand that when the US doesn't oppose it, that means it's okay. It's like a green light to go.
Especially in light with the discussion about lifting sanctions. But I am, by the way, not convinced that the U.S. government, that this administration, fully understands how power is actually used or exercised in the Middle East. That may sound, I don't want to sound uh,
Yeah, I agree with
cynical,
you, and I would
but I just feel like there's a disconnect in messaging because um, I don't think they fully understand how to exercise power correctly. I don't think they understand how the Middle Eastern states think about it, and I don't think they understand what it means to be sending this sort of mixed messaging to, in the middle of a great deal of uncertainty on other fronts.
unfortunately, some offices in the United States government these days, they don't understand the difference between the US and the UN. You in the US, you have power to use it. In the UN, you have media to issue statements, to worry about situation. You don't have power to send it to change. You don't have diplomats to go and order. You don't have embassies in the UN. You don't have like military that people are afraid of, and they don't like the using of forces or the using of military, but that's policies. We study how to use it for the good reasons, because there are people you need to save. With great power it comes great responsibilities. you cannot say, oh, I cannot change that. No, you can, because you introduce yourself to the world as the greatest power. And you have to use this power. It's your responsibility to protect the people when you can. And that's the difference between the US and the UN. We saw Kofi Annan and Ban Ki-moon and the other secretary generals. They were worrying about the situation in Syria for the last 11 years. And they still. But the US acted in Syria. The UN did not. So that's the difference. And now the US is playing the role of the UN. They are issuing statements, denying and feeling worried. And maybe sometimes they would, like, we would say, like, we feel bad about the situation in Syria. Okay, you feel bad, but what you are doing, tell me how you would change that bad to be at least not bad or like good. So
There is another factor that, in my opinion, may explain the hesitation of this government, of the Biden administration, to take any decisive action or to clarify its position on any controversial issue, and that is they are so mired in the image of the US as being internally racist, corrupt, bad, whatever, that if they're so conflicted about the image of the US, how can they possibly use the US power to take
uh,
action anywhere else? This sort of moral relativism comes with a price. The more you think about trying to do, the more you're stuck in the idea of doing good, you let the perfect get in the way of the good. You get, you lose
yeah,
the
but
opportunity to. Mhm.
saving civilians is not racist. Saving,
No.
we are not asking to send army. We are not asking
Hmm.
anymore for no fly zone, which also it's not troops on the ground. We are asking for diplomatic support for not letting the countries normalize with the Syrian regime, because that will give legitimacy to the Syrian regime, and that would let them, like, will let the criminals who killed 500,000 people just like go away with what they did. So it's not for us, it's for the families of those who lost their beloved ones. It's for the people who the US used to promise of and hosted them many times in the US and in the UN and in Geneva and in Brussels. They funded those organizations to work for justice and accountability, to promise the families of their victims that we're gonna work on making justice and accountability. If the world would see that the US didn't stand for justice and accountability for in a small country in Syria, how they would believe that the government would support the justice and accountability for the whole world? If you are talking about making the good image of the United States, show me how you do better in the world, not only in the US. In the US, okay, it's your people, your citizens, your country, but also the US has, like, we used to make this joke that the US election is more should be abroad. All countries should do American election on selecting the next president, because he influenced all the world. The White House set policies for all the world. So, but another point I want to say about what influencing what they are doing in Syria, I would not call it policy on Syria, is Iran. We remember since Obama was in office, they didn't want to piss off Iran because they want to continue the track on
Do
the nuclear deal. And
you think this is what's
Iran,
happening now as well?
I think it has the lion's share of the decision making on anything in the Middle East now. I
Hmm.
remember the first 2 months of Biden in office, there was more than 4 or 5 direct attacks from Iranian militias in Syria and Iraq on American bases, like American bases. And I think was 2 or 3 American contractors were killed in Iraq, one in Erbil airport and two in the, I think, in the air bases in Iraq, and one was injured in Syria. So, uh, and the US did nothing because they don't want to do any escalation with Iran. They want to make Iran feel safe to achieve the nuclear deal, to bring them back to the table. And all the negotiation in Vienna and like the off-table negotiation, it's reaching nothing, just making Iran feel more in power and making Iran feel that they have the upper hand on the table. Meanwhile, I mean, before it was like showing the force to Iran that if you don't comply with our policy, if you have red lines, Obama had red lines on the chemical attacks, and he drew it, and I think that's his biggest regret, that he would wake up and sleep and say, I wish I didn't say the chemical attacks are red line, because he never stood for that. But in Trump administration, when there was chemical attacks, he bombed the Syrian army and bombed the Iranian militias. He killed Qasem Soleimani, and I'm not comparing in the which administration is better, and I don't want to go in that debate. It's American policy. American people has the upper hand in that. I'm just saying that the Iranian militias right now, they are feeling more in power in Syria. And the current administration doesn't want to bother them or doesn't want to escalate against them, because that will, in their mind, that will affect negatively the negotiation on the nuclear deal. And they don't want to have that. It's I think the nuclear deal is the top priority for the current administration.
So you brought up an interesting point about the Iranian militias, and I was going to get to that because one of the arguments UAE influencers have made to justify this current decision to make this very public first meeting between their foreign minister and Assad in Syria, and calling it a brotherly nation and hugs and so forth, everything that would normally be befitting to to respected leaders. The insinuation was that it's thanks to UAE's soft power and pressure that Assad fired an RGC commander, a general who was allegedly responsible for setting up his own corrupt black markets that were apparently in competition with Assad's black markets. First of all, I'm not entirely sure that this is directly related, but even if it is, does it really make a difference given Assad's dependence on Iranian troops and militias for his security? And what can UAE offer that Iran, as a substitute?
Nothing, and I think that's just talking about individual general that who was pushed away for, and they didn't push him away because he was bad leader. They pushed him away because he was corrupted, not because he was a criminal. That's what they said. So it's just like he was serving, maybe he was serving another master. So they want someone in, especially in the customs area. So they want someone to maybe serve their interests. So if that story was right, I mean, we still don't know if that story is legitimate or not. But it's just justification. I mean, is UAE against Iran? No. Iran is the biggest contributor in the Emirati market and investment, and like look how many people are from Iran working in UAE and vice versa. So UAE absolutely is not against Iran. And even like, are they supporting the Saudis in the war in Yemen? No. So why you want to be against the Iranian in Syria if you are not against the Iranian in Yemen? I mean, that show me that this story is individual, just to justify their visit to Syria, to say, oh, we went there to kick out because the Assad regime would never move out of the Iranian hands. Iran has been supporting the Syrian regime for 10 years, 11 years. They contributed with money, men, militias, oil. They got sanctioned, they got bombed, not to just take the Assad to the safe bank, and then he would say, "Oh, that's fine. Now I have the UAE and Jordan coming to rescue me. So goodbye, Iran." No, then Iran gonna kill him if he does that, and he knows that, and he would not do that. So it's not
So what
that,
did you?
oh, if Arabs get closer to the Syrian regime, that would push the Syrian regime away from the Iranian
Mhm.
hands. I don't believe in this theory.
Would it be fair to say that, in fact, the normalization by other Arab states would actually sort of help Iran? First of all, they would have less money to spend on certain things, and second of all, some of these corrupt deals going on there, and there'll be corrupt deals, they will benefit Iran because it will probably be able to siphon some of it to its own needs.
Yeah, some of the countries they never left the collaboration with the Syrian regime. They never ended the collaboration with the Syrian regime. As I say, they left officially and on the media, and
Mhm.
they evacuated the embassies because they saw in 2011 the US and the EU they were doing that, so they wanted to join the group as okay, let's do that. And it was the Arab Spring, so everyone was going to their cave, trying to protect themselves. And now, as kind of the Arab Spring is unfolding, we see the son of Gaddafi running again for presidency. We see the old guard from Egypt going back to presidency. Uh, Lebanon, with all the mess happening, it's still the same regime governing there. So they are just regrouping and trying to do it in the official way now to reopen the embassies. What deals can be achieved, we don't know. Time would reveal, but absolutely, it's not going to be a good thing.
So there's something missing for me in all of this. For UAE, it would have been much easier to sell to the international community. Okay, Assad is sort of there to stay for pragmatic reasons. We're going to cut some deals, security deals to protect ourselves, business deals for whatever reason, whatever. But we'll just, but they went all out on this. They, this very public meeting, the rhetoric, the hugs with somebody who is possible for mass murder. How are they going to justify later on uh, having to, first of all, how they're going to criticize other countries for doing the same, and that includes the US and its negotiations with Iran. And if in the future their attempts with Qatar or Turkey or whoever else don't work out and they get back to the board, how do they expect to generate international support for their own positions when they just crossed a red line in giving a hug to this guy, not cutting deals, not just coming to some sort of pragmatic agreements for security reasons, which I think everyone can understand, but openly embracing this individual. How are they, why did they feel the need to do that, and why? How are they hoping they will later be able to not be confronted with this policy when their own needs arises?
Yeah, I would say it's on the contrary. It's not that they have to justify to the world how they are, why they are doing that. It's that it's if UAE didn't have green light from the US and from the international community to go and do this visit, they would not go there. And as I mentioned in 2000, end of 2019, when UAE wanted to do that and the US said no, so they stopped. Obviously now they had that back channeling and they got the green light from the US administration and to don't oppose that. And maybe some other countries also they would follow, but it was the first. UAE had to initiate that, to be the first one who is testing it and sending signal that we should all do that because the US government and the international community would not oppose that kind of visits and initiating this relation with the Syrian regime.
So would you say that even the overblown rhetoric and the optics around it are also a way of kind of testing the limits and basically showing their own, basically signaling their own initiative in that regard. The messaging, it's not that they love Assad so much or that they don't understand that it looks completely inappropriate from any standpoint, but that
No,
they're
they understand
deliberately
that it
doing
would. Yeah, they understand that it looks inappropriate to the people, to the Syrian people, and to the human rights activists, and to the people who believe in justice and accountability. But the countries, when I say international community and the countries, I mean the governments, like U.S. government,
Mhm.
EU, Germany, France, who used to be leaders in that field of international relation and managing the relation between the countries, and especially regarding the human rights and all of that. So now they believe that those countries would not oppose that kind of relation with the Syrian regime, where before in 2011, the US and the EU asked those government to boycott the Syrian regime due to the massacres he committed with the Syrian people.
Right, but I'm pointing at something different. I'm pointing not just to the fact of a formal visit or some official, you know, reinstitution of the relationship. I'm talking about the way it was done, the optics of embracing him and not merely coming to some arrangement or agreement. What is the message there? Is UAE trying to tell the community that they're now calling the diplomatic shots and they can do whatever they want? Are they trying to say that they consider that, is that their way of showing that not only are they coming to some arrangement, but they fully consider Syria as if nothing happened? What exactly has this gesture suggested in terms of understanding, and who's the audience? Why are they sending this completely over the top messaging when something lesser would have sufficed?
So the message is clear here for me. The message is Assad won. That's what they are trying to say, that
Hmm.
the victory is for Assad. He won. Syria had long fight with terrorists, Qaeda and ISIS, and now it's time to go and visit Syria. It's time to go and do business in Syria. Everything is normal, and we are sponsoring this relation. We are sponsoring the Syrian regime. So it's like when you bring celebrity to take a photo with
Hmm.
bad singer or bad actor, just to use that photo on social media to say, look, he has connection, that celebrity is sponsoring him. So that's what they are doing. It's like Assad won the war, everything in Syria is over, it's going back to normal, forget about what happened before, it's safe to go there. That's the message.
So now I'd like to kind of shift a little bit, but it's still relevant to Assad and this whole situation, because in addition to this diplomacy, with this diplomatic overture to Assad, which seems completely disproportional to Assad's international standing, who is he to be embraced by UAE in such a manner? He's a dictator, fine, all right, but he's also a murder of 600,000 people and so forth, but he gets a hug. So at the same time, UAE has pursued a diplomatic track with Turkey, which has been open to these overtures for reasons of its own. One of the issues that they've discussed is creating an economic corridor that would run through Iran and not through the Suez Canal, and would create sort of a direct link between UAE and Turkey. Now, this seems to be sending a signal that, okay, they're now shifting to viewing Egypt as more of an economic competitor, I guess, and they're trying to maybe uh, take care of two potential threats at the same time: Turkey and Iran. If they have an economic relationship, they are less likely to be attacked. Is that what's going on, or is there more to the story?
It could be part of the story. Also, when you were talking about that, it came to my mind that the pipeline, the gas pipeline, which starting from Israel to Egypt, Jordan, Syria, to go back to Lebanon. So it could be a lot of deals happening, and that maybe would give them some money. but we cannot say there is one reason. I'm sure it's a lot of reasons. It's a lot of deep relation of 40, 50, 60 years in some countries of like regimes controlling that country, governing and building networks of commerce, trading, economical deal, and all corrupted by a group of people or family or sort of deep state, I would call it. So it's not like we cannot say it's only because UAE want to sell gas to Turkey, so they want to start relation with those countries. No, I believe it's way more than that, and I believe it's like hundreds of variables which can be blown up.
What effect do you think such a development would have on Syria and Iran's position in Syria? Considering that Syria is kind of part of a land bridge for Iran through Iraq and all the way to other parts of the world.
Sorry, can you say again? Sorry, there was a glitch. Can you say again?
Considering that Syria is kind of a part of Iran's also land bridge from Iran through Iraq to Syria to other parts of the world, what would an economic corridor from Iran to Turkey through, linking up UAE, what would it do for Iran's presence in Syria?
Yeah, Iran is more interested in the corridor through Syria because they wanted to go to Lebanon to threaten
Mm-hmm.
Israel. So, and it's not for trading, it's not for business, it's more for military. They want that corridor, Iran, Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, so they have that leverage of pressure uh, on Israel to like what happened a few months ago and what happened in 2005 6. So it's more of military, militia, terrorists, smugglers transferring weapons. So they want that corridor where nobody looks into what they are doing. And I don't think that kind of work would that type of business would work with Turkey. Turkey is more restricted on their. It's not part like Turkey has a good relation with Iran, but it's not part of the alliance between Iran, Hezbollah, IRGC, and the Syrian regime. So I don't think that kind of maybe they would do some business. Already the trading between Turkey and Iran is like in billions. It's very high. But also also Turkey has very good relation with Israel. So I don't think the business between UAE, Iran, and Turkey can change the situation because Iran is more interested in the corridor, like Iran, Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, as I said, and that's their golden treasure of which they have fighting for it for a decade.
Let me put it this way. In the past, Turkey has helped Iran um, evade various sanctions through oil for gold programs and so forth. And we've seen that RGC had played, had come to an arrangement with Turkey in terms of abducting um, dissidents and activists and engaging in certain level of drug trade there. Do you think it's
Mm-hmm.
also possible that UAE could become a center of smuggling activity for those two countries, even if not directly with each other, then separately for their own needs?
UAE would not engage in anything which can cause sanctions on them
I'm not talking
or
about on the government level, of course, but could this economic corridor be misused or abused by third parties to kind of
yeah, but
smuggle?
but if the UAE would engage in that corridor, so that would be on under the UAE governmental support, not UAE businessmen.
Mhm.
So having that type of work with Iran is too much on like too much with a relation with Iran because Iran still has sanctions and also the democracy in the US would make you feel worried that you don't know how in 4 years the situation would turn. You don't know who would be in office. If even if they achieve the deal of the nuclear deal with Iran, Iran was saying to the U.S. government, like, how can I trust that the next president would not revoke the deal like Trump was doing? So UAE would be careful about whatever they are doing with Iran because they are a global hub for business and global hub for companies and global hub for media. So having any sanction or any problems with the US, they are also like one of the biggest hubs in for like flying. So that's why they would be very careful about not misusing their relation with Iran and their relation with the US. So, but yeah, it could happen. What you were saying about Iran, Turkey, UAE could happen. It depends on also how the relation between Saudi Arabia and UAE would goes. I believe now it's not on the best shape. That's why we are seeing some visits from UAE to Turkey, which also kind of not a friend, used to be not a friend to Saudi Arabia. So Saudi Arabia relation with Dubai, with UAE, would play a big role about where Dubai would go.
Do you believe there are some third parties interested in exploiting divisions between UAE and Saudi Arabia specifically for the reason of turning each country towards their, different sorts of sets of interests, including Iran, Turkey, and so forth?
You mean third party like who?
Uh, could be could be Iranians themselves, could be Qatar, could be actually organized, or even private individuals making to make profit or from different types of relationships. Could be particular factions, not specifically governments as a whole, but could there be such efforts?
Yeah, it could happen. What we have seen in the last 10 years, we got many surprises. And that's how they say in politics, you don't have enemies forever, you don't have friends forever. So, like, we saw how the relation between Egypt and some Gulf countries got thrived in the last 10 years, but also it was thrown out by other countries. So uh, it could happen. And also, if it's more toward leaning toward fixing or getting closer to UAE to be closer to Saudi Arabia and more away from Iran, and that would change the equation in Gulf and in the region in general.
What I am seeing overall, though, is that with the coming of the Biden administration and its single minded focus on Iran, Iran ends up benefiting from what everyone else is doing because if the signal is that the US only cares about Iran and nothing else, and Iran is going to be allowed to do whatever it wants, then these countries have more of an incentive to cut deals and come to some sort of arrangements with this power as they see it.
Yeah, they already benefited from from the let's call it from the changing in the U.S. policies, like how you opened your talk when you say like revoking the sanctions that was millions and millions of dollars and reveal like being liquidated to the Iranian government. So they are benefiting from that. They are being more strong, and it also depends on how long the U.S. government would maintain that policy because they are doing this. The U.S. government is doing this policy in order to control Iran. That's how they were saying, or like get Iran to change their behavior. But if Iran would not, and if Iran is going to escalate more and maintaining the same behavior, so I don't think the U.S. government would be able to follow the same policy they are following now on Iran.
Now, let's imagine for a second that either this administration changes its mind, or the Congress changes and starts giving more pushback, or some other administration eventually comes to power. What would you be? What would be the advice concerning Assad? Your advice concerning Assad in the event he's still there? Do you think? Uh, do you think he would be forced to comply with the conditions for the Caesar sanction removal under a tougher administration? Would he ever consider doing those things? Do you think there's any possibility at all of some other model of governance emerging? And if so, where would you see that starting a starting point for something like that? And do you see the refugees, the millions of people who fled the country, ever actually returning to Syria under the current conditions? Because this is an argument people are saying that as a result of this return of business to Syria, the refugees will be motivated to come back. I'm not sure that's true. What do you think?
So the refugees, I would start from that point of the refugees. The refugees would not go back voluntarily. If you would catch them, arrest them, put them on a plane and send them to Damascus, and you call that retrieving, or you call that voluntarily going back home? No, that's sending people to face their destiny, which could be death, which mostly would be death. So, but would anyone, like, if they would be able to live in Syria, they are not happy. I swear to God, they are not happy about being in camps, in tents where it floods in winter and burns in summer. They are not, people are not happy of having this life. Also, people who are internally displaced inside the Syrian government areas, they are not going back to their homes because they cannot fix it, because they can't live there. And also some areas, it's not allowed to people to go back to their homes because it's this area controlled by, they don't want these people who used to live here and demonstrate on every Friday and sometimes on every night against the government and sing and dance in the streets and put photos against the regime. They don't want those people back. They don't want those people to go back to this area. They don't want this area to be built again. So people who are from this area, they still living, sometimes some people, they still living under the Syrian government control, but they can't go back to their areas because it's like they are just not allowed. So no, refugees would not go back homes under the current circumstances. I would refer to the Amnesty report was released last month about what happened to the people who went back to Syria, and they documented hundreds of cases for people who died or arrested or like harassed or under by the army or the intelligence, starting from the borders, and sometimes they allow them in and then they go and punish them later. And so that's about the refugees. The other point was about what the advice would be for a new policy on Syria, or if there's change in the government, in the U.S. government. I would say just maintain the pressure on the Syrian government to comply. First, for me, is releasing the detainees, who there are about 200,000 people who still arrested. Some of them maybe died. We don't know about that. Some of them still alive. So I believe every day we are losing people from those people who are in prisons now. So make pressure on the Syrian regime to release that. And on the long policy, I would not make policy. I would just say follow the policy which was in place with the UN, the United Nations Security Council Resolution 2254. It says it all. It says there are 3 steps to solve the crisis in Syria, starting from political transition, and then constitutional committee to write constitution, and then elections under the new constitution. So just do those 3 steps. It's Security Council resolution, not vetoed by was not vetoed by Russia or China. So all the world agreed on that. So just do it, and do it under the seventh chapter, that whoever don't comply with it, they would be punished. So that's the solution in Syria.
And the last question, I kind of wanted to get: do you see any possibility of any regime change in Syria? And if so, what would that be look like? By whom? Where would something like that even start to blossom? Even such an idea.
Yeah, the regime would be like, it would come to a point where we will have regime change, but unfortunately, it's not now. It's like not near now, but it would come to a point where the regime would be different.
Do you see Beth's ideology still having a great deal of influence, or were people disillusioned by by what happened?
It's so the Ba'ath Party is more like a military control for the country.
Hmm.
And in the last 10 years, yes, it was evolved more, and it was more like military grip on the country. And the Ba'ath Party is popular in Syria because whatever you want to do in Syria, you have to be a member of the party. Even if you want to be a teacher in a school, you, like any governmental employee, must be a member in the party. So
So
that's why
essentially, it's
it's
kind
very.
of. But do people really believe in its core kind of ideology? Would you say, or is it?
No, no, it's just like on papers. Like I was member of the Ba'ath
Mhm.
Party, and usually when you are in the, think it was like when you are 12 years old or 13, 14 years old, they just give you papers of, you have to sign those papers in the school, which is joining the party. So it's not
Mhm.
that. Sometimes, like some people, they join the party and they never knew about any of the principles or something. And at the end, the bad thing is not the party. Any party, any, when you have any constitution and you have authority of implementing it, then it's fine. But in Syria, the problem was not the constitution. The problem was not the party. The, the problem was the military and security controlling of the day-to-day life of the Syrian people. So that's the problem. It's not about a party or government or constitution. No, it was like 50 years of corruption.
Mhm. Well, we are facing a difficult situation. Unfortunately, the current trajectory is not particularly promising, but things can always change. We've had surprises. We can maybe one day have
Hopefully,
more positive surprises, and
hopefully, yeah.
um, because we've had some positive surprises over the years as well. So we'll continue hoping for the best and continue paying attention even to the things that normally the media does not cover or doesn't pay attention or doesn't want to show. Thank you so much for joining us. It was very, very insightful, very helpful for me to understand, to make sense of the seemingly senseless developments. And I hope you'll all tune back next week, 9 p.m. The Washington Outsider Report here on the Coalition Radio. Thank you for joining us, and see you next week.